Welcome to episode 2 of my Kawasaki KDX200 engine repairs, and in this episode I'll be putting the engine back together, getting it back in the frame and starting it up for the very first time. The new connection rod bearings and seals have arrived for the KDX200 engine, so I can now start putting it back together. So the first thing I do is compare the connection rods, and they look identical, so I'm really pleased with that. The replacement crank pin also looks good. I check its diameter and length and it's exactly the same. This is a good quality aftermarket replica of the original Kawasaki parts, because the new old stock parts for this bike are getting really hard to find, especially in the UK. So the next thing I do is put a bit of grease on the crank pin so I can press it into the flywheel web on my hydraulic press. I place the new crank pin onto the flywheel web and line it up by eye so it's vertical. Then I can press it down using the hydraulic force to force it into the flywheel web. These are a really tight fit. Between 3 and 5 tons is not uncommon. With the crank pin pressed in flush with the outer side of the flywheel, I can now assemble the needle roller bearings, cage and connection rod onto the crank pin. So first I put on a bit more grease. The new thrust washers are a nice sliding fit on the crank pin compared with the old ones, which are a rattling fit. And it's nice that the rollers are encapsulated into the cage so they don't fall out. Because some cages, the actual rollers fall out when you pick them up, which is really annoying. But these ones are just perfect. With the crankshaft set back up on the press, ready to press together, I go around with a set square to line up the flywheel webs to make sure they're as close as possible as being in line. The more accurate I get this now, will save time later on in the truing process. With the flywheel webs aligned by eye, I can now start compressing them together using the hydraulic pump. This just gently pushes the ram down and squeezes the crankshaft together in a nice controlled manner, and I can then use a set feeler gauge to set the gap to give the right side clearance for this engine. I insert the feeler gauge and it's just perfect, so I'm really pleased with that. So now we can true up the crankshaft using a copper hammer. So what you do, you find the high spot using the square and use the copper hammer to hit it very carefully until it goes down flush. This can take some time, but in this case it happened quite quick. It's just a matter of luck. There's no science to it. You have to hit it, hope it moves the right amount. If it moves too much, just hit the other side until it moves back. The thing to remember as well is you always use a copper hammer or a lead hammer. Never use a steel hammer, because the steel hammer will just dent the flywheel webs and doesn't transmit the force through into the crankshaft, whereas the copper hammer transmits all the force through and doesn't leave any marks. I then put the crankshaft between centres in my lathe so I can rotate it and check the run out with a DTI. When I look at the measurement, it's less than 0.01 of a millimetre, which is well within specification, so I'm quite happy with that. I double check both sides and it's exactly the same both sides. So now I can take the crankshaft out of the lathe and start building the engine. All of the engine's components are assembled into the right hand crankcase, so the first thing I'm going to do is warm up the bearing area with a blowtorch. This expands the aluminium very slightly and allows the bearings to be tapped in much easier. And it only needs to be hand hot to make the difference needed. So now, the first thing I do on this engine is put in the oil seal for the crankshaft. This presses in quite nicely with a little drift. It's quite a tight fit, but presses down nicely until it's flush with the inner surface of the crankcases. Then I can unwrap a new bearing. I've chosen high quality SKF bearings. They're probably the best bearings you can buy. They're slightly more expensive, but it's worth paying the extra money. I gently tap in the bearing, ensuring that it remains square as I'm doing so, by going round and round and round with gentle taps until it's in flush with the crankcase inner surface. You can tell because the sound changes as it hits the back and it goes to a sharp tap. There we go, that feels really smooth. And the seal looks great as well, so I'm really pleased with that. So now we can start assembling the inner gearbox parts for the gearbox. So I've put it up on 2 pieces of wood so the spindles can protrude through and not hit the bench. Then I pick up both gear clusters. They need to be assembled into the crankcases in one piece, otherwise they won't fit. With both the gear shafts in position, the next thing I need to do is put in the selectors. There's 3 selectors on the KDX200 engine, and they only go in one place, so I've actually marked them with a pen so I get them back in the right place. And when they've actually engaged with the selector drum and the gears, you can drop the shaft down through the centre. There's 2 shafts, one for the lay shaft and one for the transmission shaft. And basically you give it a little bit of a wiggle and a twist and a push, and eventually it pops down into the lower crankcase with a snap. That's it, perfect. So now the shafts rotate freely because the selectors are holding them in the correct place. I now put a bit of grease on the crankshaft journals and the gear shaft journals so I can slide that into the crankcase nicely. It's a tight fit in the bearings and needs to be pushed down hard. And the grease also helps lubricate the lip of the seal as it goes in so it doesn't damage it, which is really important. With the crankshaft in, I put a bit of grease on the other side of the journal and some around the gearbox journals as well. This also helps it slide onto the crankcase as I lower the crankcases together, making it engage nicely. So now I put some jointing cement around the joint, paying attention to go around all the holes and make sure it's all covered completely. Then I can lower on the other side and squeeze it down tight with the screws. It's quite a wiggle to get the crankcases to line up with all the shafts, but after a while I can tap it down with a rubber mallet just to make sure it goes down tight. It's a real tight fit on the crankshaft bearing compared with before. With the crankcases touching, you can see the gasket cement starting to ooze. I put in the screws and tighten them up evenly with my T-spanner. When I rebuilt this engine in 2007, I bought new old stock screws for the crankcases with the correct 8mm hexagon heads. These are much better than cap heads in my opinion, especially on dirt bikes because the mud gets in the cap heads and fills them up, making them hard to undo. So now it's time to press in the new gear change oil seal. This taps in quite nicely using an old crank pin as a drift. I smear a bit of grease onto the seal, then I can turn the engine over and slide in the gear shaft. And at this point I'll be checking if the gears work. It's really important to check the gears work at this stage because if they don't, you can just take it apart and fix it. If the whole bike's built and the engine's in the frame and you've got no gears, that's a real chore. The gear shaft slides in nicely and you have to line up the 2 dots, one on the gear selector and one on the selector drum. So you just rotate it around until the dots line up, then the shaft presses down with a click and it's engaged nicely. So now I put on the gear lever temporarily and check and get all 5 gears, which I can, and neutral, so that's really good. With all the gears confirmed as working, I can continue with the build. So now I'm going to fit the kickstarter mechanism. So I first put a little bit of grease on the back. This holds the shims in place as well, which is a useful thing, because you don't want to drop a shim out. So the shim slides on the shaft, and I can turn that over and put that into the crankcase, and pull the spring round until it engages with a little hole, and that pre-tensions the kickstart spring. You have to be very careful when working with springs. They hold a lot of energy and they can fly off or spring round and hurt your fingers, so you have to be really careful. The next thing to fit is the kickstart idler gear. So first I put on its shim that rubs against the little circlip, then the idler gear itself, then another shim, and then another circlip. They're a bit fiddly and tight to get on, so I push them down with a screwdriver until they snap into the groove. It's always nice when you hear that snap as it goes into the groove. So now I'll give it a quick wipe round with a cloth, and that's that part done. The next thing I'm going to fit is the front drive sprocket. This goes onto the crankshaft with a single Woodruff key. It's quite a tight fit, but I use the nut to draw it down. By tightening the nut, it draws the sprocket down onto the actual shaft and up against the stop at the back. You can feel it go really tight. Well, that feels really smooth and absolutely no play, so I'm really pleased with that. So now we can get the clutch on. So first there's a shim, followed by the inner bearing, then the clutch itself. The inner drum can be a bit fiddly to engage. It has to engage with all the clutch plates and the central spline. So once it's on, I can tighten the central nut and put on the springs. Once all the springs are on and the front plate's on, all the screws, I can then do up the main nut really tight because it locks the clutch together. I lock the crankshaft with a small plastic handle with a screwdriver, and I can do the central clutch nut up really tight. The clutch nut has a Bellevue washer beneath it, which is like a spring washer. This prevents the nut from coming loose. So now it's time to fit the clutch cover. So I first fit a new gasket, locating it over the two location dowels. Then I gently lower down the cover, making sure I engage the clutch release mechanism and the kickstart oil seal without damaging the lip. Finally tightening the screws with my T-spanner, then I can rotate the engine over onto its other side and fit the magneto stator with the two cap heads. And make sure the woodruff key is inserted correctly into the shaft. With the stator plate tightened up and lined up with the original timing marks, I then lower the rotor down very carefully over the woodruff key to make sure it engages with the slot and not just push the woodruff key out. And what you do, you double check for a tiny little bit of play, then you know it's engaged, and then you can do up the nut in the centre. I feel the crankshaft rotation, and it feels really smooth with sharp pulses from the magnets, which is a really good sign the alternator is working nicely. So I then replace the new gasket and put on the cover and do up the 5 screws. Well, that's the bottom end complete now, so it's time to put on the barrel and piston and cylinder head. So first I put on a new cylinder base gasket, locating it over the studs. Put a bit of oil on the little end eye, ready to insert the new needle roller bearing. After extensive searching, I wasn't able to get a new piston for the engine. It's completely obsolete now for the 83 and 84 models, but I did get some new old stock rings. But the piston itself is actually still within service limits, so I'm okay to use it again. But I'm going to keep looking now and keep an ongoing search for a new piston, maybe a Wiseco one, but I can only get them from 85 on. When you fit the rings, you've got to make sure the little N mark or R mark is facing vertical to the top of the piston on the top ring. The second ring doesn't have a marking, so that can go either way. Then you rotate the rings backwards and forwards until the pegs line up nicely. I insert the gudgeon pin ready and make sure the arrow on the piston points towards the exhaust port before putting it onto the engine. So you give the gudgeon pin a gentle push and a wriggle until it engages with the little end bearing and slides right through. Then you can put in the circlip until it snaps into place. I had to use a screwdriver to push this back in and make sure it went click. It's always nice to hear that click when you know it's in the groove, and I always double check this to make sure. I can then put a bit of oil on the piston ready to lower the barrel down. The barrel has a generous lead-in taper at the bottom of the bore, so the piston rings are quite easy to fit. You just give them a bit of a squeeze and a wriggle and a bit of a twist and a push, and finally it goes down and looks really nice. Then you have to wiggle the washer in at the bottom. It's a little bit tricky on the KDX engine, but you can do it with 2 fingers, and spin the nuts down and use a special 13mm spanner that ground down to fit. And that's it, the barrel's bolted down. I decided to fit the kickstart now so I can give the engine a quick kick over on the bench to see what it feels like with the cylinder head off, and you can feel the primary compression spitting air up through the transfer ports, hitting me in the face. I'm going to be reusing the original copper gasket, so first I need to anneal it using my blowtorch. You apply the flame to the surface of the copper until it glows red hot, then you can either drop it in water or let it air cool. It does the same thing. It makes it go soft as marzipan. I prefer to quench in water because you can pick it up straight away, give it a wipe and use it. And here you can see how soft and supple the copper's become. You can bend it backwards and forwards easily. So when it goes on the engine, the idea is the copper gets moulded into any imperfections on the barrel and cylinder head to form a gas-tight seal when the nuts are done up tight. I tighten down the cylinder head nuts and fit the spark plug and give it a kick over, and it's got amazing compression. I'm really pleased with that. So now it's time to fit it back in the bike. As I'm walking through, I just check if Tracy's okay. She's not in the kitchen, but she's in the lounge, and she's knitting. She's just started making a hat for my friend Guy. I don't know how she does it. She sort of pokes the sticks through and over the top and round and pulls the string through. She looks up and I can tell it in her eyes. She's counting, so I leave her to it and go back outside with my engine. But on the way past, I noticed a tin, and there could be some cupcakes left over from last week. And I lift the lid and have a look inside, and there's 4. So I take one. She won't notice. That was so nice. The KDX engine is so light I can easily carry it up the garden and drop it straight back into the frame. You have to wriggle it a little bit and get it to engage with the swing and arm. But after a little bit of fiddling, it goes straight back in, ready to put the swing and arm spindle through, which is the first thing I have to do. With the engine resting in the frame, I think I can hear Tracy calling me. So I go back to the back door and she's made me a nice cup of tea. But she didn't bring me out a cupcake because she said I've already had one. Oh dear, so she did notice. Never mind. The swing and arm spindle is quite tight, so I have to use a rubber mallet to tap it in. But eventually it goes through, securing the engine in the right place in the frame. So while I'm there, I connect up the spark plug and the electrical connectors. The next thing to do is to fit the upper mounting plate to the engine. This has 3 bolts, two go through the frame, 1 goes through the cylinder head. So I engage the 2 top ones first, and I have to pivot the engine up on the swing and arm spindle to engage the lower one. So now I can fit the front mounting plates and the crash bars, one each side of the frame. And while I'm down in that area, I connect up the clutch cable and adjust it. And that works just great. I'm really pleased with that. I feel like I'm being watched, so I look up, and it's that pigeon again. I'm sure it's the same one, but they do all look the same. With all the bolts finger tight, I then want to fit the chain, and then I go around and tighten all the bolts with my socket set. I feed the chain on the back sprocket, through the frame, round the front sprocket and back through the guide to the rear sprocket. Then I can engage the link. The robin comes and lands right next to me. He is so tame, just sits there watching, then flies off. I fit the spring link with the closed end facing the direction of travel. This is really important. If you put it on the other way around, the chain could come off and cause a problem. With the chain fitted, I now go around and tighten up all the engine bolts. Next to go on is the carburettor, followed by the air filter box. The airbox rubber is still nice and supple, which is amazing considering it's nearly 40 years old. The exhaust is straightforward to fit. It simply pushes up into the stub up against the back, and you put on 2 springs and 1 nut, and it's fitted. With the front expansion chamber fitted, and before I fit the rear silencer, I'm going to go in my shed and give it a good buff up on my vintage buffer. I first apply some fresh buffing soap to the wheel. Then I start polishing. This machine brings everything up so shiny. It's really good. It's got quite a strong motor. You can put a lot of force on it and get a really good shine. And the aluminium comes up like brand new. It looks amazing. The heat from the buffing wheel was making the oil smell inside the silencer, so I thought perhaps I'd better change the wadding, otherwise it's just going to smoke still. So I got on my Yamaha YL1 and went down to the local shop to pick up some new wadding and some oil for the gearbox while I was there. All right, Clive.
Good morning, Alan.
I'm after some really important stuff, my KDX.
We've got some very special stuff for you today.
Gearbox oil and some wadding for the silencer.
Got it in stock.
I've known my friend Clive at Motorcycle for over 40 years. In fact, we used to race together in local enduros. Back in the garage, I need to take the rear silencer apart to remove the old wadding that's soaked up with oil. So there's 3 screws on one end and some pot rivets on the other end, which I need to drill out so I can remove the central core. The pot rivets drill out easily because they're made of aluminium. I grip the silencer in my vise on the mounting bracket and the central core pulls out nicely. Then I can pull out the old wadding. It looks okay on the outside, but when I unroll it, it's really black and oily on the inside. This would have made loads of smoke. So then I clean the central core with a wire brush to make sure it works most effectively. The new wadding is exactly the right size for one silencer application. You just roll it around the central core, squeeze it back into the outer case and slide it in nicely. Job done. All that remains to do is to do up the 3 screws one end and re-pot rivet the other end. So I tap it in with a hammer to make sure it's a tight seal, get my pot rivet gun, put the pot rivet in and squeeze. And as you squeeze, it compresses the rivet together, making it really tight. And this is how pot rivet works. As you squeeze the gun, the rivet gets compressed from the end in, making it wider, so it draws the 2 pieces together and clamps them tight. The central draw wire of the pot rivet snaps at a predetermined force exerted by the pot rivet gun, ensuring a tight fitting every time. With the silencer refurbished, it's now time to go back out into the garden and fit it on the bike. It slides onto the front expansion chamber, then 2 securing bolts clamp it in place on the frame. With the exhaust system now complete, it's time to top up the oil in the engine, turn on the fuel and see if it'll start. I pull up the choke and give it a couple of kicks and it bursts into life and sounds amazing. I am really chuffed. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm really pleased how the engine sounds. It's so much smoother as well with that crankshaft bearing sorted out. Anyway, I can't wait to get out and give it a test. And let me know in the comments if you want to hear how I get on. Well, last night we only got one hedgehog come and visit, and he certainly is a fast runner.